Now we're going to have the third session, which is Russia, the war, subsistence farming, and the future of Russia as a global wheat exporter. Our first panel member is Professor Judith Pallot from the University of Helsinki and the Alexandria Institute. So she's a professor at the Alexandria Institute and an emeritus professor at University of Oxford. And her research focuses on agrarian transformations in post-Soviet Russia and the geography of penalty in Russia. Professor Pallot is on the editorial board of Eurasian Geography and Economics as well. So we'd like to extend a kind welcome, and please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I have to say that I feel something of a fraud here because I'm in such illustrious company of people who actually know something about agriculture. I worked on the Russian peasantry and household production in Russia up until about 2005, when I switched direction and started working on prisons, and I've been since then working on difference in the post-communist and communist prison systems, looking at some of the legacies. So what I'm going to do today is attempt the impossible, which is I'm going to be revisiting my research on the Russian peasantry, and I'm going to combine that with my current research on prisons. So this requires a little bit of mental gymnastics to do this, but hence the title. So I'm not just going to be talking about agriculture and food production. I'm going to be talking about the rural in broader terms and looking at its, if you like, contribution or its place in the current war in Ukraine. Okay, so I'm starting with this fittingly with Babushka Z. I don't know if you're all familiar that this is a picture of a Ukrainian peasant woman who greeted who she thought were Russian soldiers by coming out with the Soviet flag, and they were soldiers were bringing a food box. And she has become a propaganda icon for the Russians. And what she symbolizes is rural purity, the essential national qualities of the Russian world. So think Platon Karatayev out of War and Peace. In fact, there's another story behind Babushka Z that if anybody's interested, we can talk about in the question session. So what I'm going to be talking about is three things. So I think I've got 5 minutes for each of them. One is food production, where the household plot is being used to fill the sanctions gap in agricultural production in Russia. I'm then going to be, I've called it rather nicely, labor for infantry. I was going to use a common English term, which is cannon fodder. And so this is the way that rural people in Russia are being used as the primary source of volunteers for the infantry in the war in Ukraine. And then I'm going to be talking about the militarized Russian landscape, rural landscape, which includes, I think we can include in the military landscape of rural Russia prisons. The prison system is militarized, and I will talk about the various ways in which the prison system is supporting the war in Ukraine for Putin. So I'm starting with some quotations here that I'll leave you to read, but basically what they're showing is that the Russian state, in fact, ever since 2014, when it first invaded and occupied Crimea, and then the two so-called democratic republics in east of Ukraine, it has been called upon, the Russian state has called upon the personal private farming sector to fill the sanctions gap. For example, as an example, the head of the social welfare department in Kurgan, for example, says that we aim to help families provide themselves with one of the main foodstuffs so that in the conditions of sanctions, we won't have to buy potatoes from Egypt. And this isn't the first time that the household sector has been called upon to save Russia from a crisis in food production and save it from food poverty. And I'm not going to go through all of this because Mikhail did that for us earlier today. So the story in Russia is very similar to Ukraine, and that is immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this fall in GDP, a lot of farms just went out of production, and there was an expansion of the household sector, both in rural areas, and urbanites were given allotments on the outskirts of cities to be able to grow their own food. So that was all the way through the 90s, and you can see there from that graph that the relative share of food production coming from the household sector grew between 1992 and 2002. But thereafter, there was a recovery of large-scale agriculture, and relatively the contribution of the household sector, which is the one in dark green here, fell compared with...
Ja, hallo, sorry, nog even met Diederik Kramers hier. Over de afspraak voor maandag. Ik dacht al dat er iets was, maar 11:30 zal het toch niet lukken. Ik kan wel om 2 uur 's middags, lukt dat?
Oh, right.
Ja, oké, noteer ik 2 uur. Oké, dank u wel. Tot dan. Dag.
Okay, right. So where was I up to? Right. Okay. So there was a decline in the contribution to total value of agricultural output in Russia, and so can you hear me out there? Can you hear me? Can you raise your hands if you hear? Oh, good. So I can go on. So there was also an absolute decline, and the map on the left shows the dark green shows the amount of land abandoned by household production, and you'll see that it's largely concentrated in the northern part of Russia, which is the non-Black Earth belt, so it's not the principal agricultural region. So the story is much the same as in Russia, as in Ukraine. So now Russian small farmers are being called upon to fill the sanctions gap. Now, of course, one of the points we have to make is that they shouldn't be called sanctions in this case, because food exports to Russia are not included in the sanctions list. But what Russia has done since 2014 is embargo the import of food products, manufactured and non-manufactured, from unfriendly countries. And of course, the number of unfriendly countries has been increasing rather a lot since the 24th of February. So the question then is this going to succeed? And the answer to this is, I think not, for reasons that we began to touch on earlier with Mikhail. So on the first, under subsidies, okay, so that the state, for the first time in 20 years, is paying attention to the personal subsidiary farming and to allotment farming of urbanites, which is, it's just ignored. It's just been assuming that this sector would wither away with the development of agro holdings. Which it hasn't done, but it certainly declined, as I said. But now they're trying to draw people back into household production who had left it. So the sorts of subsidies that are being either already in place or being proposed from the beginning of next year, the state is providing money for subsidies to the smallholding sector. But in Kurgan, for example, what they're doing is that they are offering free seeds to any household producers who haven't been growing anything on their land for the last 5 years. And where livestock are concerned, they're going to be giving sufficient funds to buy half a cow to household producers who haven't had any livestock in the last 3 years. Okay, so, you know, the subsidies are not particularly generous, and we don't quite know what the central subsidies are going to look like that are going to be introduced from January 2023. So it's going to depend a little bit on what the subsidies are and whether they're going to work as an incentive. A major point is the marketing. It's all very well the household farmers producing more on their land. The question is getting it to the market so they can feed themselves, they can feed their families, they can feed their friends. But the question of actually marketing them is a completely different question. And in fact, there's no marketing infrastructure in the Russian countryside to speak of. In the Soviet era, there were marketing cooperatives, and they no longer exist. And so the question is, how do the peasants get it to market? And the peasants really don't feel a need to get the produce to the market. So there's been a lot of the surpluses have simply been being thrown away. So this whole question of how you market the produce. Then there are the other consequences of sanctions, and that is that, you know, spare parts, seeds can't be imported, and other areas of sanctions are going to impact on the household production sector. And Russia has never developed any serious small-scale machinery and mechanization for the household sector. So that's another problem. Then there's training in new technologies. I have to say, I've got this list from various people who've been writing about this. And so I sort of was curious about what this means. And another way of putting it is that the peasants are too dumb to modernize. And we're talking here, and this goes back to the question about eco-farming and sustainable farming. You know, the household sector is not very good. It likes to say we don't use fertilizers, therefore we're organic. But of course, being organic has lots more to do with it. And, you know, the argument is that the peasants haven't been trained sufficiently, aren't sufficiently well educated, especially if they're babushki, like babushka Z, to be able to use and integrate these new ideas and technologies into their farming. Then there's a problem of labor supply. There has been a mass outmigration of young people from the countryside, particularly up in the non-Black Earth belt, which is where the largest populations that are the ones that need the food being marketed for them. And there just aren't enough people out there in the countryside, or they're, you know, at the higher end of the age scale. So that's another problem. And then there's just over-bureaucratization. Okay, so when I did my work with Tanya Nefedova 20 years ago on personal subsidiary farming, you could just get on with it. You weren't going to be taxed. You didn't have to fill in any forms at all. Now it's become highly bureaucratized, and there's the personal subsidiary farmers have to get licenses. And this means filling in paper and having an engagement with the local agricultural office. And the peasants, for the most part, are not prepared to do that, and which is what they would need to do in order to market. So I think for all these problems, which can be solved, but taking up what Michal was saying earlier, they can't be solved in the next year. They can't be solved in the next year, and in the longer term. Right. Oh yes, and then yeah, the other point and was that actually there aren't that many people who want to take up offers, for example, of uchastki, of plots to start growing their own vegetables. So Muscovites who are asked about it, you know, sort of reply, well, you must be joking, you know, and the opportunity cost is not in favor of that. So you see that there are only 7% of a completely unrepresentative sample that was done by Komsomolskaya Pravda, who have not tried to grow food before, but they're going to try this year. You just see how they get on. Right, so that is number one. You've got the rural as providing food resources in the time of war. And the other area where, in fact, the Russian government is being much more successful, I think, in providing resources for the war is in recruits for the army. And if you read this here, it basically sums up what I want to say, or what is the situation. And that is that military service has low prestige. So most normal people wouldn't want to join military service. People who sign up do so because of hopelessness. Everywhere there is poverty, no prospects, no career opportunities, reliance on subsistence production to feed their families. So, and this is the words of somebody from Buryatia. And Buryatia, which is in eastern Siberia, is one of, we think, and I'll explain to you why we only think, we're not certain about this, provides the largest number of recruits into the army that's fighting in Ukraine. So the Russian government, surprise, surprise, doesn't actually produce any figures about how many people have been recruited since the beginning of the, sorry? Oh, is that all? Oh gosh, right, okay. Does that include the time when I had to compete with somebody else? No, it doesn't. Okay, so I got 3 minutes. Right. So what they're using instead as a measure, what we have to use is actually the number of people who are being killed in action and that we can count, that we can verify. So these are people who are dying in action and their relatives are writing about that on Telegram and in the social media. And there are people, the BBC and the opposition newspaper Medusa has people on the ground who are going around cemeteries and looking at recently buried people where there's a picture of a soldier there. And out of the predicted either, between 10 and 30,000 people who have died since the 24th of February, there are 3,100 verified deaths. And you can see from the map what the geographical distribution of these are. The vast majority of people who have died, which we assume are, is some measure of the people who are, number of people who are recruited, is from the south, from the Caucasus, the North Caucasus region, and from eastern Siberia. And this map gives a slightly more nuanced picture of that. So it's dividing the deaths according to which branch of the military service they came from. And basically, any of the red and the blue and the black are all elite forces, and these are professional soldiers who have chosen the military service as their career. The brown ones are the infantry, and these are the people who are dying in disproportionate numbers, I'd venture, although we don't have any confirmation of that. And they're the ones who are coming from places, as you can see from the map, in the south and in the North Caucasus. And so Buryatia, Dagestan are at the top of the list in terms of number of fatalities. And this here is simply showing the relationship between these places which are providing the greatest number of deaths and relating them to the level of rural services. And so the graphs are showing the percentage of houses in rural areas that have running water, central heating, gas and sewage system or a septic tank. So you can see that places like Buryatia, Tiva, Altai, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast and Zabaikal have an incredibly low level of rural services. And they are also places with 10 to 20% unemployment, which is 2, 3, 4 times the national average. Of course, the other thing that's very obvious from these high death regions is that they're also the national minority republics. So they're recruiting soldiers from the poorest places in rural Russia, and especially in the ethnic minority republics. So if you'd like to just read this, what this final quotation is saying from one of the NGOs is that in the earlier conflicts that wars in which Russia was engaged, as in Chechnya and in Georgia, they did recruit, for example, from the European part of the country. By the way, there are only so far 3 recorded deaths in Moscow Oblast. And Putin learned that lesson because there was a lot of protest associated with those wars. And so that's why there's been a very conscious campaign to recruit from the rural peripheries in the war with Ukraine. And this person, Ivan Ilseev, actually goes on to say that the people who are joining up aren't doing it because they support Putin, support the war. They're doing it because they need the money to survive, which speaks to what we were talking about earlier. Okay, the last thing. You can allow me to talk about this. Right, so this is where I get onto prisons. So prisons and peasants both begin with a P, but there's a little bit more that connects the two. Rural peripheries have always played a major role in securitization of the Russian Federation. Large swathes of rural Russia are under what they call military polygons. One of the interesting things in my earlier research is how often the peasantry would say that they pastured their goats in the polygons, and Tanya Nefedova would always go white and say, don't ask, because she was terrified I'd ask where they were, and make some stupid comment about what the death rate of the sheep was in those places, but that's a different matter. But part of this military landscape are the prisons and places of detention. And as you probably know, there are lots of places of detention in Russia, and a large proportion of them are in extra-urban rural locations. So there are over 1,000 penal institutions in Russia. And what has emerged in the Russian countryside is what I call, penal regions. These are large areas which effectively are the fiefdom of the Russian prison service, where you have a very high density of Russian correctional colonies, and the whole of the economy of this large swathe. The whole of the north of Perm Oblast, for example, is one large penal region. So these the economies are all based and reliant on the prisons. They provide the labor for the prison service, for the guards, and so on. And Russia has, since the 24th of February, but in fact, actually before that, from 2014, it's been adapting its penal estate to receive large numbers of additional prisoners. And these are both people who are being repressed within Russia and ending up in prison. And you all know there's been a clampdown on any protest and opposition in Russia since Putin came into power, but especially since the 2010, 2012. And it's also created space for the victims of the war in Crimea, in Ukraine. So it has made plenty of places available in its penal estate for people who are captured in Ukraine. And I've calculated, been monitoring this a lot, and I've calculated that, believe it or not, there are 300,000 spare places in correctional colonies in Russia. So the Russians over the last decade have cut the total prison population from 1 million to 500,000, but it hasn't closed any, well, it's closed some, but it hasn't proportionately closed the proportionate number of penal facilities. Now, what of course it's doing in taking the people it's capturing in Ukraine into the prison service, into the criminal justice system, the ordinary criminal justice system, is against the Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war, so the combatants in Ukraine, should be being held separately from ordinary prisoners and should be being treated differently. But they're not. So, and this is one of the reasons why, or one of the consequences of Russia saying that it's not in a war situation in Ukraine. And we know from what happened after 2014 that the preference, what the Russians do, is they capture someone, for example, in Crimea, the Crimean Tatars. They move them out of that area as quickly as possible into southern Russia, into a remand prison there. They're then tried there, or some of the more important ones are taken up to Moscow, and then they're sent out to the peripheries. And the reason they do that is then it's completely out of the reach of NGOs and, until the 24th of February, foreign journalists and all the Council of Europe up until recently. And what is here is just an example of what happened to somebody called Oleg Sentsov, who was a film director who was captured in Crimea in 2014 for protesting, he was immediately taken into up to Moscow to Lefortovo prison. He then went down to Rostov, where he was tried. Of course, he was found guilty, and then he was taken on this route all the way across Russia, and was stayed in correctional colonies in these various places. But then there was a prisoner exchange, and he ends up going back, and he's now fighting against the Russians in Crimea. It's of course too early for us to know whether the same policy is going to be pursued with Ukrainians who are captured at the present time and actually aren't killed or executed in situ. And the commander of the Azovstal battalion has already been taken up to Lefortovo prison in Moscow, and there will be a trial, possibly a show trial, and then he might well be executed because Russia has withdrawn from the Council of Europe, or he might go on that same sort of journey as Sentsov. Now, I did have one. Do you want me to stop there? Well, can I just make one little point, and then we can take it? And that is it, because it goes back to the whole question of migrants, because Russia has been pursuing a policy under Putin the last few years of trying to stop Central Asian migrants, and has been looking at ways to substitute for them, to find substitutes in Russia. And surprise, surprise, those substitutes partly come from the prison population. They've introduced in 2017 a new punishment, which is called forced labor, as an alternative to the deprivation of freedom. I have to say that the Russian prison service PR needs a little bit of help, I think. So, and these prisoners are going to be used to solve, and this is absolutely in the policy, it's written it, solve the migration problem, to be able to reduce the dependence of Russia on migrants from Central Asia. And of course, the other source of replacing Central Asian migrants are the Ukrainian deportees, or evacuees as they're known, refugees. Russia says there's 1 million of them. This is gross exaggeration, but there's somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000. Where are they ending up? They're ending up in the rural peripheries, and they will be substituting some of that seasonal labor. So that is, okay, so that was just a picture to show this. I will not say anything more. There we are, finished. And I'm so sorry if I went over.
For this whole session, right?
Yes, no,
yes, okay, so then we can, yeah, okay, wonderful. Then maybe we can move to the next presentation. If you could put it up, it's which is on the implications of Western sanctions for Russia's technological innovation and food export. And we have, which is going to be by Dr. Oane Visser. I think everyone knows him here, so maybe not too long an introduction necessary, but still he's an associate professor in the agrarian studies at the ISS. He's been a visiting scholar at University of Oxford, City University New York, Cornell, and University of Toronto. His research focuses on land grabbing, global mega farms, digitalization of agriculture, food interactions between small and large farms, rural cooperation, particularly in the EU and in Eastern Europe. And Oane, do we?
Yes, thanks for the introduction.
Yeah? Okay. Take it away, yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me well in the room? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so where Judith Pallot focused on the smaller farms, I will look here at large-scale agriculture and even super large farms, and looking at the implications of sanctions. As Judith Pallot mentioned, some of those sanctions are imposed by the West on technology for agriculture. But a lot of the food sanctions were self-imposed by Russia already after the 2014, after Crimea. And this is joint work with Meline Khachatryan, ISS alumni. So Russia has seen a a remarkable rise from being in the 1990s and in the Soviet era, often a country importing food, at times even importing wheat. In the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia even received food aid for a while. And then in the 1990s, there was also a further slump in production in agriculture, triggered by shock therapy, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So we saw large-scale land abandonment. We saw a huge drop in input use in terms of fertilizer, pesticides, etc. And as a consequence, a huge drop in yields, both in agriculture and livestock. Then, more or less coinciding, but not caused by the rise to power of Putin in early 2000s, a remarkable recovery set in. There was a kind of deal between the Kremlin in the early 2000s and the oligarchs, that all those oligarchs would obtain their wealth by often through shady deals, confiscating big industry and energy assets, that they finally should then use some of their wealth to invest in agriculture. So then we saw the emergence of big so-called agro holdings, very big farms, just as in the case as what Michal Varga showed in Ukraine, very large farms, sometimes up to 500,000 hectares large. Also, foreign investment came in from say 2005 onwards, and we saw first the recovery of arable farming, the wheat sector, the sunflower sector. Russia turning into an exporter and an importer, and then later on a recovery in livestock. And then 2014 onwards, we saw another impetus to this growth. That was this food self-sufficiency drive, the embargo of Western food products, and also the strive for technological sovereignty in agriculture. So it was not only about food self-sufficiency in food products, end products, but also there was the aim to become more self-sufficient in terms of all the inputs for agriculture. Next slide, please. So here we see crop yields, for example. If we see like the second pair of is 2000, we saw that then this is in centners, which is 1.0 ton, that in around 2000, before the rise and the recovery, there was just yields of 2 tons per hectare. And by 2014 and later, we see that this increased by 250% to some 4.5 or 5 tons per hectare. Still low compared to some countries like France, but yeah, an impressive growth. And next slide. Also, there were, especially following 2014, there were all kinds of targets set to increase food self-sufficiency rates for a lot of products. And basically all those targets were also met, which was, we could say, quite an achievement. So you saw that vegetable oil, sunflower, for example, from 2014 to 2010, around almost self-sufficient to even 2000% self-sufficiency. We see that actually also in vegetables, not fully, but a clear growth. And also in livestock, we see that meat, for example, went from 72% to 100% food self-sufficiency. Then the question is, yeah, those targets, are they all reality, or is it partly a kind of Potemkin village, referring to the cardboard village which was put up by Count Potemkin when Tsarina visited the newly acquired areas in the south? how real is all of this? Yeah, these achievements, which look very impressive. And what are the effects of the new of the war, of potential sanctions, the SWIFT blockade, etc., etc. So, what are the short-term and long-term effects? With all of this, of course, I think it's probably stating the obvious that is not only impacting Russia, I think, and the Russian population. Food self-sufficiency will not be, in terms of the population, will not be threatened. And there are also the household plots, which Judith referred to. But it will have huge global effects, especially for countries in the global south. And it's always good to realize that with ongoing climate change, Russia is one of the few countries which are actually set to benefit from climate change, compared to most of the world, which is set to have lower inputs due to climate change. Yeah, so you see the green countries are those which are set to benefit from climate change, and the orange and yellow ones all set to be negatively impacted. Of course, there are a lot of details to the story for Russia. The fact that the statement by Putin that climate change is on our side for agriculture is too optimistic, but definitely Russia will be impacted much less than a lot of other countries. So in that respect, Russia being already a big food importer, what will happen to agriculture is of global importance, and it will not diminish with climate change, probably to the reverse. Next slide, thanks. So what are the short-term effects now? Russia is self-sufficient and exporter, of course, in fuel, in fertilizer, in fodder. There's sufficient land, so those are not the problems, obviously. The problems are more in the sphere of high-tech inputs, and then high-tech both in terms of equipment, in terms of spare part, but also in terms of hybrid seeds and medicines for livestock. Problems probably will not arise for this season, because there are still a lot was bought already for the agricultural season. But in some cases, there are immediate effects. For example, in Russia, also digital agriculture emerged, like smart farming, like remotely controlled combines and tractors, increasing the yields and the precision in the fields. But they depend on, for example, on the software, on GPS connections. And a lot comes from, for example, the US company Trimble for navigation software. And that was immediately kind of turned off. The connection was turned off by the company from the US. And the combines are basically, and this was also confirmed by web desktop research we did in Russian sources, of farmer journals, etc. They complained that they have no signal anymore, and they invested a lot of money, and they will have to go back to the old way, doing it on site without precision technology. You saw that also with stolen equipment from Ukraine combines, which were then remotely disabled by the US companies like John Deere. Of course, we know there are also lots of Russian hackers, so probably it is only a temporary problem. They will find ways, probably, but that has to be seen. And also spare parts are now already drying up. So this is a problem already probably hitting later in the seasons for the foreign technology. Next slide, please. Then long-term effects. One is seeds, hybrid seeds. So there is, although there was this target already set for 2020 to become 75% self-sufficient in seeds, that was never a really strong focus. And as a consequence, it also was not achieved for most crops. So, for example, sugar beets, all the sugar beet seeds are for over 90% imported from Belgium, Netherlands, etc. There are only 2 big seed factories, and one is even a joint venture. So it's unclear whether that will still continue to deliver. Maybe yes, maybe not. Own selection, especially for a crop like sugar beet, will be a very time requiring process. Yeah, will take years, maybe decades, as one Russian expert stated. So he stated that the selection race we started to lose already in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is definitely an Achilles heel. And now Putin has kind of reinstated this year, the 75% target, and now for the coming 8 years. Yeah. So it is a new budget is now flowing into that direction. But yeah, this is a matter not solved in a few years. And next slide, please. We see that, for example, in wheat and barley, this position is very strong for Russian agriculture. This is all domestic varieties which are effective and high yielding. So the wheat sector will not be affected. Yeah. In corn, however, we see 55% is import dependent, the seeds. So here we might see partly a replacement in terms of fodder by the wheat sector. Yeah, basically redirecting exports towards fodder production, own domestic fodder production. In vegetables, we see also strong dependence for seeds, for example, from the Netherlands. Next slide, please. And here we see the rates for different crops. For those who can read Russian, you can see it. But on the right side, the left is light blue is foreign. So you see there on the right is the strongest dependence. This is in sugar beet. Then in the next one is potatoes. But there quite some progress is now being made. But for example, also in sunflower, the third from the right is still more than 70% imported seeds. So quite a dependence. Next slide, please. Another long-term effect is equipment. We discussed some brief, some short-term effects, but there are longer effects ones. We see already in overall in the equipment sector, in for example, the car industry, that the joint venture with Renault was abolished, and that basically Russia, the Kremlin decided to reopen the Soviet brand and factory of Moskvich. Next slide, please. And the Russian group Leningrad even made a song about this new brand, the Moskvich, and singing that it is more like a time machine, catapulting you back in Soviet times, and basically you need most of the time you need to throw it rather than to drive it. So there are different challenges there. Next slide. And that is also the same for the tractors and combine industry. It appears that there is quite a number of components with made in China on it, while first it was claimed to be all Russian produced. Yeah, this, for example, for the big Rossel mass combines. So there is this desire to create technological sovereignty, but yeah, there is this big question: to what extent is that possible, even for big companies of big countries like Russia, but even for the EU in a world which has become so high tech and interwoven. Yeah. Next slide, and the rest we will skip for time's sake. So in terms of the capacities on the Russian side to become more autonomous and sovereign in terms of innovation and technology, there are a large agro-tech manufacturers, also especially when you combine also with Belarus, with the big tractor industry. There is also a substantial ICT industry sector, and there is a sizable number of startups, for example, in smart agriculture, in digital agriculture. A number of there are shown there. Next slide, please. There is also a large domestic market for agtech technology, so that helps to boost the sector. And since 2014, the policies to become more independent have indeed had effect. That more technology has become domestic. Next slide, please. So this import substitution technology strategy for technology in agriculture, you saw that now 60% of the technology is produced locally in Russia. Yeah, thanks. But problems for further innovation is that there is not a real culture of startups and venture capital, a lot of bureaucracy, which kind of strangles those promising startups in agtech. And so state support is very essential, also because the oligarchs are often not interested in putting their money in high risk startups. And there is a very one-sided focus on one particular institute, the Skolkovo Silicon Valley, while ignoring long-standing innovation hubs, for example, in Siberia, in agtech. Next slide, please. So further challenges are that a curtailed access to Western satellites. Russia has its own satellite network, but they are less precise, whereas the Western ones are precise on the few centimeters, which is kind of needed for real precision agriculture. Also, another problem is the import of semiconductors for all those combines, and especially the smart agricultural applications. One alternative might be Chinese semiconductors, because South Korea and Taiwan are banning, sanctioning exports and technology to Russia. But the Chinese variants are much lower quality, and there seems also to be a hesitation amongst the Chinese firms to export to Russia and not to get sanctioned by the West. One of the alternatives is recycling old semiconductors. It was found that even in tanks, destroyed Russian tanks in Ukraine captured that sometimes dishwashing semiconductors were reused in tanks and trucks, etc. So that we might see more of that. And one other challenge is the brain drain of ICT people who now fled to Turkey, to Georgia, etc. And most of the ICT people will be, attracted by the military industry and the energy sector. Next slide, please. So going to conclusions,
another minute or so.
Yeah. So there is some kind of impressive food self-sufficiency if we really look to the food products, but the Achilles heel is those high-tech inputs and replacing them on the short term, and especially with high-quality inputs. And so the short-term impacts for this year are relatively small. The longer-term effects are substantial, and that is also, I think, a bad message for countries in the global south dependent on Russian food export, especially in the face of climate change, if we look at the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you, Oane. So maybe questions? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I would like to ask a question to Oane. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I would like to go back to Russia-Central Asia relations, actually. And I've been wondering, recently actually saw that Russians moved into Central Asia for temporary residence, actually settling temporarily in the Central Asian capital cities. And I've been wondering, you talked about shortages of seeds, and there are some of the seed companies, for instance, Dutch seed companies have headquarters in Kazakhstan, and of course marketing as well in other Central Asian republics. So I was wondering if there would be an opportunity, or if Russian companies have been going to Central Asia actually to purchase large volumes of seed actually for production in Russia. That was actually, and another issue is, I was wondering, I didn't mention myself, but Central Asian agricultural sectors actually have been, it has been said that production in Central Asia could replace part of the imports that come normally from Europe. So I I'm wondering if you also know something about this, for instance, horticulture or vegetables, actually, if they are imported from Central Asia. In terms, so that's basically the production itself. Thank you.
We can collect a few on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. I have a question to both of you. To some extent, you can consider the war a memory war, a war of memories. And those memories are very actively cultivated, mobilized, both on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. Now, from your stories, I get impressed by the strong sort of overlap of Putin's notion of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, that he needs to protect and support. And because it's a memory we'll also bring back. This, as Judith shows, there is a remarkable revaluation of formerly devalued labor reserves going on, and a revaluation of all sorts of peripheries and margins. And when I listen to Oane, then there's a revaluation of domestic technology capacities, domestic technology, domestic manufacturing in one way or another, in any case, domestic agriculture going on too. Now, so there's this interesting overlap between Putin's notion of the Ruski Mir that must be brought back and protected, and the actual political, economic, technological processes of revaluation against the globalized induced trend of devaluation of labor and of domestic technologies, etc. Now, does it make sense for the two of you to see it this way? And might you elaborate a little bit on it?
Thank you. Yeah, my question is to Judith. So, I mean, you raised a very important point about Russian authorities being able to better control access to markets, the access of smallholders to markets. But I was wondering, I mean, it sounds like a major achievement in comparison to past times, but the question would be, how effective is it? Yeah, does it create side channels? Does it create opportunities for people to actually avoid those controls? Does it take the nature of campaigns that people can sit out and return to production, to informal unregistered production afterwards? And the other question is about these, the recruitment of soldiers from the ethnic republics. I mean, what would your explanation be? How come that these societies, these ethnic republics have escaped the outmigration that you mentioned earlier? Yeah, so how come that the local labor forces seems stabilized in the rural areas?
We are running short on time, though.
Right. Okay. So the question about memory and so on. Yes, that is terribly interesting and important. And I think I understand what you're asking. I mean, one of the as you know, the most important, if you like, memory, well, it's no longer a war. It's, you know, it has had a victory, is about the Second World War, or rather the Great Patriotic War. And of course, that is, and the memory of the starvation and the deprivation from that time is very important, as is the linked idea, belief that however bad things are, Russia will come through. It'll suffer enormously in the process. When the back is against the wall, as it's now being presented now, Russia will come forward and be able to survive. So it's this dual understanding of the Russian Mir that is based both on the idea of Russia always being a victim, but also always overcoming that patriotically, and by the mobilization of all forces and the sacrifices of everybody. But I think you're right that what has happened in the current war is that they've sort of rediscovered the peripheries. But they've rediscovered the peripheries largely because they realize that the metropolitan centers have dangers associated with them. I don't think that's actually answering your question, but it certainly is this rediscovery of labor. And I think that the other thing this war has done, and actually what has been happening in the war, is that it has shown that Russia has actually put too much confidence in technologies which have been found not to be able to win the war. And actually it's boots on the ground. And so they've had to say, well, who are going to be these boots on the ground? It's the Russian people, including those, but especially those in the peripheries at the moment, because we don't want to use Muscovites. On the just to sort of on the out-migration, on the labour force point, well, you have out-migration from rural areas where you've got somewhere to migrate to, like booming urban economies. Buryatia has nothing. It doesn't have a booming, urban economy that would attract the young. It's a long way, and who in Moscow would necessarily, yes, some of them do, but not all of them do. And those who remain behind, it's one of the choices. Do you try to go and get employment in Moscow, or do you actually go to the Voenkomat and join the army, where you're now going to get 30,000, 50,000? And prior to that, they were, weighing up different alternatives. But, these are a long way away. Some of these people haven't actually been out of Buryatia until they find themselves in Ukraine. And on the first question, I'm not sure that when you're talking about the control of access to markets, are you now talking about the way in it has started regulating the household sector? Yes, well, I think the thing is it has actually started to regulate the household sector, but the household sector has responded by just saying, okay, we'll feed ourselves. We're not going to try to market our produce. So there's been a response. But it was a sort of over-bureaucratized attempt. And the other thing that, of course, has been a discussion that's been going on for years now is taxing the household sector. And I think the household producers are just terrified that if they start using formal channels to market their produce, the state is going to come in and tax them, which is why they prefer to throw surpluses away than market them. I don't know if that's answered your question.
Oane, maybe you could.
Yeah, I'll add. First, about the question by Don about the kind of war of memory and certain re-evaluations. I think indeed there is a re-evaluation ongoing of the past, of the Soviet era, definitely. I mean, it was longer in motion, but it's kind of now accelerated. And also a revaluation of the rural space that has also was already a longer trend in the Putin era. When I was doing research on social movements, also together with Natalia Mamonova in Russia on rural movements, there was this tendency, like in 2013, 14, 15 onwards, like seeing those rural movements as where is the real Russia, and the middle class who started to want freedoms and become more westernized were seen as corrupted and not real Russians. And then the real Russia was to be found in the countryside. So there was a lot of also phantom movements which were created by the Kremlin, a kind of phantom rural movements to give this sense of getting control over what was going on in the countryside. And what regards technology, I think there is a bit of an ambivalent, has been a bit of an ambivalent stance by the government. On the one hand, there were very ambitious goals in terms of digitalization in agriculture and elsewhere. But for example, in some areas, there were strong hesitations. For example, with GMOs, also very strong anti-GMO current, for example, quite interestingly, and not seen in debates in the West, and highly emotional discussions about it. And we see that, and what's also interesting is that in terms of the re-evaluation of labor, what you mentioned, that when I was doing long-time research and staying at farms in Russia, especially some 5 years and longer ago, then there was a lot of breakdown of technology, because the Russian, before the foreign equipment came in, was a lot of Russian equipment, and it depended actually on its functioning on constant repairs by combine drivers and tractor drivers. And I think that you will see more coming again. So they were, although there was this idea of the demotivated Soviet worker, especially demotivated farm worker, there was definitely a core of motivated workers which were very capable of, with minimal inputs, to keep technology running. So there is also a certain pride, as Judith also mentioned, in the face of crisis and shortages, to keep things running and be resilient. Yeah. And then in terms of the questions by Irna Hoffman about the role of Asia, Central Asia in for example, evading sanctions or finding alternatives. I recently attended an online webinar with people from Central Asia, and then, for example, especially from Kazakhstan, there is quite a stance that we won't play the game of helping Russia to evade sanctions, at least from the state side. But I think when you go to private companies, it's a very different matter. They will see golden opportunities there. And other states in Central Asia will also be more inclined, I think, to help. You see also that lots of people go to Uzbekistan to open accounts, etc. There are all kinds of ways. Kazakhstan is the country which is, also because of its powerful position with oil, as the most assertive stance, but at the same time depend on Russia, because to get the oil out of the country, much has to go through Russia. Yeah.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Oane. We have 5 minutes left for coffee, but we still have 15 minutes before we get back at 4:30. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.